January 2018, and there was optimism in the air at Davos as the world's great and the good made their annual pilgrimage to the snowy retreat. 10 years on since the 2008 financial crisis, confidence had returned to the boardroom. The stock markets were exuberant, with the Dow Jones Index hitting a record high. Donald Trump told leaders at the World Economic Forum that America was open for business. What a difference a year makes. Fast forward 12 months, confidence is faltering. And dark clouds are gathering beyond the horizon, with the IMF cutting its predictions for global growth this year. So, what has caused the sea change? Against a backdrop of populism, protectionism and geopolitical uncertainty, a number of factors stand out. First, US interest rates have been rising. Trade rifts have erupted between China and the United States. Some of the tech giants have been stumbling recently, and time is rapidly starting to run out for an orderly Brexit. It's not all doom and gloom here in Switzerland. There's talk of a new wave of transformation, which the World Economic Forum is calling Globalization 4.0, a revolution that will lead to upheavals in such sectors as transport, communication, healthcare and energy. A revolution that seeks to rewrite the rules of finance, trade, pay and taxation. Inevitably, the talk here in Davos will also be about artificial intelligence. PwC is predicting that its potential contribution to the global economy by 2030 will be $15.7 trillion. And some business leaders believe that AI will have a bigger impact than the internet revolution. What we do know is that with the rise of mobile and internet services, there'll be big winners as well as some big losers with the growth of AI. If only we could accurately predict who they'll be, or even where the world's economies or the stock markets will be this time next year. Now, where's that crystal ball? So hello and welcome to Davos, Switzerland. We're here for the live launch of PwC's 22nd Annual Global CEO Survey. I'm Juliette Foster and I'm joined by Bob Moritz, who's the Global Chairman of PwC. We'll also be revealing the results of the survey in just a moment. Bob will also be answering questions from the world's media who've joined us in the room for this press conference. I'd also like to welcome our global audience of viewers who are watching this webcast online. So thank you for taking the time out to join us. Bob, it's an extensive survey. A number of themes have been raised. We will look at those, but let's just take the broad brush view. From what you found, where do CEOs believe that global economic growth will be heading in the next year?
Well, first off, thanks everybody for attending today live here in Davos, but also virtually on the camera from the webcast perspective. And we look forward to the engagement over the next 45 minutes or so, as well as some of the engagement that we'll have thereafter. To your point, we had an opportunity to survey 1,300 plus CEOs and take a look at what they're thinking. And now their views have changed from where we were last year. Let's go back for a second to 2018, where we had a record level of optimism and a record increase in the optimism for various factors that had happened around the world. What we find today is it actually has done a bit of a reverse, not entirely, but a bit of a reverse. The level of pessimism across the world, and especially in certain countries, has risen dramatically. The level of confidence in the economy in terms of its growth has dropped somewhat. So you've got a polarization of what's happening in terms of people's belief of where the global economy may be going. And some of that's been confirmed by some of the things that have just come out today when you look at the release in terms of the growth that happened in China and the IMF predictions that are actually continuing to decrease as we look year over year.
Okay, so we have this pessimism amongst CEOs. So how is it affecting their own expectations for growth, given that challenging climate against which they're operating?
We asked the question, how confident are the CEOs that they can actually increase revenues over the next 12 months as well as 3 years? And it's clear that, again, that level of confidence has come down because of some of the macro factors that they're dealing with, as well as some of the micro factors that are very relevant to them as an organization. The one thing I would just caution us all on is that when we look at these averages, and that's what they are, averages around the world, that we have to pause for a second and actually dissect company by company, country by country, sector by sector, some of the level of specificity. Because we would argue from our vantage point, where we have a chance to interact with many different organizations, there are lots that can execute well and their confidence is very high, and there's plenty of opportunities. There's others that are executing okay, and maybe are somewhat limited in terms of their ability to take advantage of those opportunities. And there are others that will really struggle as they look at the dynamic aspects of what's impacting them as a company, as well as the environment in which they're operating in right now.
But it's still an interesting swing from optimism last year to caution, for want of a better term, this year. So what lies behind that drop in confidence? Are there very fundamental factors behind it?
There are, and we asked CEOs around the world, could you identify, please, the top threats or risks that you as an organization are trying to manage? And what you find year over year is some interesting sound bites. First, overregulation becomes sort of number one yet again, and it's been that way for a number of years, but it's very sporadic country by country. The second thing I would tell you when you look at this particular list is that last year and in previous years, we had a dominance of a handful of risks that 40 some odd percentage of the CEOs that we interviewed all named that particular risk. Well, that dominance of certain risks has come down, and the broadening of multiple risks now have come their way. And it's not a surprise when you look at competition, disruption, technology, economics, and the potential for where it's going in terms of fundamentals as well as macro level issues, but also some of the policy issues that are out there today. And what you see on the slide is the 3 or 4 specific risks that are new this year that are risen to the top 10 that are somewhat out of the CEO's control. And I'll go back to where I went before, which is the CEOs that are doing really well in executing on the controllable risks. Those are the ones that have the confidence and have the opportunity to actually move forward. The other piece from a soundbite perspective I would give you is that how, in fact, are countries or CEOs reacting to these threats? As you see, trade conflicts, not a surprise when you look at the challenges between the US and China right now, are evident in everything that's going on, and we can't predict where it will go. But CEOs around the world are actually adjusting supply chain, adjusting how they want to think about where they want to resource, how they want to invest. And if you look, actually, CEOs in China right now, 60 some odd % of them have actually adjusted their supply chain to deal with the change from a trade conflict perspective. So again, I come back to, it's not the threats or the views on the economy, but rather what are you doing about them to actually take advantage of the opportunities and manage the uncertainties as best you can.
So find the positives in a difficult situation. But look, we've identified the threats. So how do these threats play out when you look at it on a country-by-country basis?
Well, as you see, based upon the slide, you've got a series of countries around the world. I'm going to say the majority of them really downward sloping in terms of their confidence level. But again, we have to caution ourselves not to overreact to the generalization or the averages that are coming, but rather, how do we actually get underneath what are CEOs doing about this? And equally as important, what are countries doing about this to take advantage of maybe some disruption and some voids that are filled by various countries around the world, that maybe there's an opportunity for them as an individual country to take advantage of the world that we are now living in, looking ahead.
Okay, well, that leads quite nicely into my next question, in fact, because look, CEOs are operating in a very pressurized environment. So where are they looking for growth beyond their traditional home markets?
So first off, the CEOs definitely are retrenching in terms of where they're going to look for the opportunities for growth. And they're retrenching into their home countries and into surrounding regions that are closer to home, rather than expanding, are going into new and different areas. Obviously, there's an implication on perhaps a reduction in M&A as well, as you look at the free cash flow that was excessive last year, but also interest rates rising as you look at this year. But when we ask the CEOs the question, what are the top 3 countries that you want to invest in around the world other than your home country, we actually see these results. Now, let's talk about some of the synopsis year over year. Last year, China, as well as the US, clearly number 1 and number 2, with a dominance from most CEOs around the world. And what you see in both cases is they have come down. Why? Because, again, concerns about policy issues, trade conflicts, and the like. What you see is a retrenchment to my home country. Now, what is very interesting is take a look at the 2 points to the far right on the slide, which is I don't know or no other territory. And when you look year over year, you have 23% of the CEOs putting a do not know or a no other territory compared to the combination of 9% from the previous year, which points to that level of uncertainty again. And as a result, the CEOs are not only retrenching, but also saying, hey, as I think about my opportunities, I've got opportunities for growth on the top line, but let me focus on operational effectiveness and efficiency and make sure I'm delivering the bottom line to get my house in order to take advantage of perhaps opportunities looking forward in a big time way where in fact that might be countercyclical or in fact advantageous for me compared to the competition. Those that are strong will continue to remain stronger if they execute well. Those that are in the bottom half might end up being weaker. So we might see more winners and losers in terms of the businesses and maybe even the countries that we're operating in right now.
Another key area that the survey explored is the availability of key skills. Now, again, identified as a top threat. So when you look at the talent issue in general, what are the critical issues that CEOs are having to deal with in that respect?
So at a macro level, the ability to execute comes back to do you have the right leadership team and the right skills in the organization to execute and take advantage of those opportunities. And it's clear when you look at the combination of scarcity of labor in certain parts of the world, as well as the skill sets of what you have in the labor force, it is a challenge. And you see that as demonstrated by the difficulty that CEOs are talking about. Again, it varies country by country, but you definitely are seeing an average where the degree of difficulty continues to increase, and the real question becomes, what am I going to do about it? And again, I would go to two things here. We should be thinking about this from a corporate perspective, but also from a country perspective. And I'm going to go back to the previous slide. If in fact CEOs don't know where they want to invest, that's a big opportunity for countries to say, come my way, because I actually am educating my workforce. I am actually having an adequacy of resources, and maybe you should think about me as a bigger opportunity compared to the traditional ways I've done it in the past.
Yeah, well, let's stay with that point, in fact, about how they should respond, because it's a very serious issue, the skills gap, because clearly companies can't rely on the traditional way of simply hiring their way out of the problem.
Yeah, so as you look at the results of the survey, we asked the question, okay, let's acknowledge there's a big challenge in the workforce in terms of the availability of skilled resources that are appropriate and fit for purpose as you think about your strategy. What are you doing about it? You can't wait for the problem to be solved by somebody else. And again, I go back to this theme of organizations taking control over their own destiny and executing well. What you see in an average basis consistently around the world is organizations finally coming to the realization, I can't wait for government to fix the problem. I can't wait for the education system to fix the problem. I will invest myself significant investment dollars to deal with upskilling for the people I have today to bring them new and different skill sets. That could go to production, but it also can go to digital, where technology becomes a disruptive and maybe advantageous force for those organizations. So that's where you see 46% of the CEOs around the world saying, I am going to make that investment. But when they make that investment, they've got to do it in scale. It can't be just an isolated exercise where we'll do it in this business unit or that business unit, or we can't just dabble in it. So the real challenge for CEOs is, how do I rethink the workforce I have today? How can I work together to actually move this ball forward and do such in scale that actually gives me competitive advantage, that turns it into an opportunity? And likewise, for presidents, prime ministers, and other officials, as a country, how do I take that same theme, which comes back to then how will you change your education systems and how will you increase the skill sets of your population, looking at education across the entirety from soup to nuts, from day one when they hit the grade schools all the way through the higher education levels right now.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the T word, technology, because what springs to mind, of course, is artificial intelligence. We know it's going to be an important talking point at Davos this year, but where do CEOs actually stand on deploying this technology? Because some are rather fearful about it. If it's not the cost that's perhaps putting them off, it could be other factors.
Here we find an interesting soundbite in terms of what the CEOs have told us. Everybody, including those that are here in Davos this week, are very focused on the implications and the benefits as well as the risks from artificial intelligence. Some of that goes to how do I execute in this organization. Others go to displacement of jobs. What you see in the stats is, on an average basis, the CEOs haven't done much yet in AI initiatives. And in fact, that's a big opportunity for those that are thinking about, how do I transform my workforce? How do I transform how I think about supply chains and consumer experiences and my product quality as I look ahead. So I think there's a big opportunity, but let's also make sure that we understand what artificial intelligence is all about. It's a matter of actually how do I capture data more effectively and efficiently using technology. It's a matter of how do I analyze the data. Then also how do I actually put that data into different and new information to change my decisions. And the artificial intelligence piece comes to the automation, so it happens without human intervention. And that's where, again, people are thinking about the different steps of what they have to do. So in order to drive that agenda, CEOs have got to think systematically around all of those elements and levers of change to take advantage of an opportunity. And we at PwC, as was mentioned in the video, see it as a big opportunity. The question is, can the CEOs and their leadership teams get equally educated on this topic and drive the change that actually enables them to capture it? And this is where I'm going to bring together technology and talent. When I talked earlier about the lack of skills and talent, we might generalize it and say we don't have enough from a quantity perspective. We also want to talk about the availability and skill sets of senior talent in an organization to drive change. It's very hard to drive change if you don't understand that world that we lived in. So not only are we talking about changing the skill sets for the new hires, we're also talking about changing the skill sets of senior leaders to understand the art of the possible.
It's to be bottom up.
To be focusing on what's the environment I need to create to go after the benefits from artificial intelligence, and how can I drive change in my organization to capitalize on that as I think about customer experience, supply chain management, more effective and efficient management techniques to deliver a bottom line, but also a bottom line that it actually is much more, I'll call it inclusive to the societal needs that are going on right now.
Yeah, and let's broaden that out in terms of those societal needs, because from a purely impact perspective, is there any sense about the potential that AI has to change lives?
So when we ask the CEOs this question, what's interesting on the slide is that you've got a large number of CEOs around the world that believe the impact of artificial intelligence as they look ahead may in fact be bigger than the internet itself and the adoption of that. Now again, let's caution ourselves for one moment in terms of we all underestimate the potential, and we probably overestimate the speed in which it will come as we think about different levels of innovation. Likewise here, our CEOs see a huge amount of potential as they think about the impact potentially of artificial intelligence. The question is, how quickly can I get that benefit, and how quickly will it come? And that's the uncertainty right now. So the question is, how do I set the right tone? How do I actually go after it in the right way from the bottoms up and the top down? And how do I actually go after this country by country? Because if you look at, for example, the China results versus the US results, they're slightly different in terms of the magnitude of change that may be coming and the implications associated with it. So it really causes us to go a heck of a lot deeper country by country on this particular analysis in terms of where that future looks like over the next 2 to 3 or 4 years as we think about talent, technology, and the impact of artificial intelligence.
Because when people think about AI, the association is with jobs. So again, let's explore that, the impact of AI on jobs, winners and losers.
You have a polarization of the theme of how big of an impact, positively or negatively, will artificial intelligence have on employment. And you see this based upon the numbers that are thrown out there with the differential between the 100% and what's been provided to us in the don't know category. And again, I would say that depending on what part of the world you are, where you've seen a country really focused on people-intensive manufacturing, that's going to have a big impact. Others that have a better balanced portfolio of service organizations, technology organizations, and manufacturing, you'll probably see less of an impact as you think about society. But it comes back to this theme of what our corporates and our government officials doing to position citizens of the world, citizens of those countries, potential future employees to be fit for purpose. Said differently, I think the business community and government have to work together to provide the education and the skill sets to make sure that people have opportunity regardless of what the work may look like and regardless of the company they work for. And that's going to be really important as we think about inclusivity for what I think has been a really beneficial benefit to society overall, but we've got to make sure that it's actually dealing with those that feel like they've been left behind. So governments and business need to work more so together to tackle this issue, because no one country or one business can actually solve that problem by themselves to mitigate that risk and to make sure that people see the benefits of what they're trying to do and where they're trying to go to themselves not necessarily to everybody else out there in the world.
Okay, so Bob, thank you so much for that really comprehensive look at what is in that report. And it's at this point as well that we can get some questions from our audience, both here in the room and, of course, from the internet. So can I ask you, those in the room, to please wait until you have the microphone before you put your question to Bob? And also, could you please introduce yourself and the organisation that you represent? So please, if you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand and the microphones will be brought to you. Larry Elliott of the Guardian newspaper. Well, I've introduced you, but please, your question.
Well done, Juliet.
I'd save you the time, Larry.
Larry Elliott of the Guardian. Thank you, Juliet. Do you think that CEOs were too optimistic last year and perhaps too pessimistic this year, and that the reality is somewhere in the middle?
I think we can all question, are we too pessimistic or optimistic, especially when you look at what I'll call the megatrends. If you step back and think about the megatrends here in terms of what's happening in the world where the U.S. has dominated what I'll call the policy decisions over the last 40, 50, 60, 70 years, and in fact how that's shifting to a more balanced approach coming out of Asia, for example, where you can think about the issues and implications of scarcity of resources, including labor, in terms of what may be coming. A lot of this stuff was known. It was a question of the magnitude, and then how do people interpret it in terms of their confidence level. And I'll come back to what I said earlier. Each organization has a different perspective as, is it a real threat and challenge, or is it a real opportunity that I can take advantage of right now? So you probably do squash more to the middle, but again, we go back to the facts. The facts are the CEOs believe we are going into a more pessimistic type of environment that's harder to execute on. And what we've seen over the last 20 some odd years, it's actually very well correlated to a prediction of where GDP is going. And I think you see that today in terms of what came out of the IMF and perhaps what may be coming out over the next 6, 8, and 12 months as we think about turning the predictions into realities a year from now. The other piece I would leave you with is we at PwC, and I'm going to say myself personally, you got to get out of the prediction game. Many years ago, we would have never predicted some of the things that have happened over the last 2 years. So the one thing we are talking to CEOs about, and the thing that we are talking to governments about, is how do you do a lot more scenario planning? Because you can no longer predict that future with that level of certainty. And how do you scenario plan and then move with speed to take advantage of the opportunities? And I think that's something that all organizations, corporate or government, should be thinking about as they think about executing a strategy and doing a better job on it.
Okay. The lady here in the green jacket. Microphone's on its way. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Alicia González from El País. I have 2 questions. One, if the answer of to this environment from the CEOs means a retreat in globalization. And a second one, if you see the CEOs acting, having an active role in asking the governments in this environment for more cooperative, multilateral cooperation. Thank you.
So it's great questions that I think, again, I'll come back to this point of winners and losers. For the organizations that, regardless of what maybe the policy and political decisions are, they really are focused on what's the right thing to do for their organizations and their strategy and their ability to execute. And what I mean by that is they don't get distracted by perhaps the nationalism or populism that's coming, but they see the consumer and the underlying consumer needs, the supply chain needs, and they go after it as effectively and efficiently as possible. So again, I'm going to say that good organizations are looking at the world regardless of the politics and some of the decisions and saying, what can I control? How can I take advantage of that? And how can I then serve my many stakeholders to execute really well and to talk through and communicate the benefits that go to the stakeholders that they are engaging in. And I think that's an important thing to focus on, that we don't want to over-pivot to silo behavior of nationalism, and we don't want to over-pivot to globalization. I think we got to make sure that it's balanced, and each organization's got to think about that the right way. To your second point, we are seeing more and more CEOs be more vocal in terms of bringing a perspective to global officials of, before we make decisions around policy, let's make sure we're fact-based in terms of the implications of whatever policy decision you may be making. And while there may be some headline news of what that policy decision, let's talk about the first and second and third degree effects associated with that. And again, what we want to do is clearly make sure that we protect and think about the needs of our country and the citizens of our country. But at the same time, we got to be thinking about how do we actually make sure we take advantage of the opportunities around the world. Because if every country went to a silo, we would never be able to take advantage of the opportunities that I think are inherent in the globalization efforts and the world order that we're dealing with right now.
Okay, let's take a question now from our internet audience.
And just for the benefit of the audience here today, I've got a number of our leadership team members from various parts of the world, as well as various subject matter experts that as we go through questions, I'll bring them into the stage as well so they can respond to some of the questions with more specificity.
Okay, then let's take this question from the internet. Given that the UN says we have 12 years to limit a climate change catastrophe, do you believe CEOs are taking the threat of climate change seriously enough in the 2019 survey?
So again, let's go back to facts. Last year, climate change was a big issue that was on the list of top 10 risks or threats. This year, it fell off of that top 10 list because it was replaced by some of these broader policy issues, trade conflicts issues. But it did end up being, I think, number 13, if I remember correctly, in terms of a top concern. I think the CEO community definitely is continuing to focus on the concepts and concerns around climate change. And you see that from a couple of perspectives. How do they actually set a strategy that is conscious of the expectations of thinking about a sustainable world? They are also thinking about how do I communicate better what I'm doing about these things to its investors, their business partners, their consumers, because there is a demand by stakeholders to understand what are you doing. And oh, by the way, your brand is at risk if you don't, because your stakeholders, your consumers, your employees, your business partners, and yes, your investors may not actually look at that as a positive and may run to other alternatives if in fact you're not addressing that carefully. The last thing I would say is that on this topic, you see a number of organizations creating indices and other elements to engage investors and others to say, okay, in the Bloomberg index of X, how do I actually bring together organizations that are focused on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, and other places like that to bring to life and keep this center of attention. The challenge today, with so many other issues, where does climate change actually rank in all of the issues that take the time and energy from the CEOs? And that really depends on, again, how active they are and how important it is to them and their specific scenario today. Retail consumer is a big piece of that. Energy company, big piece of that. Oil and gas company, big piece of that, et cetera.
Okay, another question from the internet. It's actually 3 questions in one. It's about our favourite subject. What about confidence in the UK? How big a dent has Brexit made? What do you think about the prospect of a no-deal Brexit? How will Brexit affect the other European economies?
So there's a lot in that question. So let me break it up into pieces. If I can ask Kevin Ellis, who leads our UK and leads the region of EMEA, which is Europe, Middle East, and Africa, maybe to take the Brexit question, and if I can, to tee him up. Harold Kaiser is here, who represents Europe, and I think it'll be interesting to bring an EU perspective to the table as well. Over to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Bob. I think one of the interesting things that comes across is I think the UK is now used to uncertainty, and whatever's going to happen on Brexit, whatever the outcomes are, although the UK is, on average, more nervous about the global economy, there's a lot more confidence about the revenue increases for their own businesses. And the other good thing coming through there is that the UK CEOs are backing themselves, because they're actually backing themselves to recruit more people this year, 61%, than they were actually expecting to last year. So I think the combination of backing themselves in spite of that level of uncertainty that they can see is a really positive theme coming through in this. Obviously, there's concerns about the talent gap, as we talked about earlier, with the need to find more technology skills. But I think, like all of us, we look into our own businesses and know that it's up to us to retrain our own and upskill our own people to meet that upskilling gap.
Good.
Back to you, Bob.
Thank you, Kevin. Harold, if I can ask you to comment from a broader EU perspective, I think it'd be an interesting contrast to what Kevin talked about.
Yeah, I think from a continental European business perspective, Brexit is much more seen negatively. On the one hand, many European territories are depending on the UK market, strong export-orientated. And second most important thing is that London is the financial center of Europe and what's happening with that after the Brexit. And even more, the uncertainties. And you see that also in the results of the confidence level, that especially in territories like Germany, the confidence level went even down more extreme due to the fact that the exports are depending on the UK market, especially the automotive industry.
If I can, Kevin and Harold both talked about differences between the EU and the UK. And as Kevin rightly said, there's opportunity as you look at some of the fundamentals with sitting in the UK. Now, one of the things that's interesting is actually to think about this access to talent. And one of the concerns coming out of Brexit is the ease of moving talent from country to country across the EU. And if I can ask maybe Carol Stubbings to come on, who actually leads our people and change and organizational businesses, to give a perspective in terms of how our organization is thinking about the people angle around the future of work, as well as the implications of Brexit and the potential for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's absolutely no doubt. If you look at most organisations, if you look at the lack of available skills that 79% of CEOs said they're really struggling with, when we think about how they're going to replace or find those skills, upskilling and retraining is going to be absolutely critical, but that has to be done at scale. But the other thing for me that really surprised me in the CEO survey was only 5% of CEOs were looking at a different composition in their workforce. And if you think about the older workers, the workers that want to work more flexibly, the people returning from maternity leave, for example, there is a whole plethora of talent out there that organisations just aren't tapping into at the moment. And, the availability of ski skills, if you look at 2012, it was 52%. It's now 79%. So upskilling and reskilling employees is important, but they need to start thinking really a little bit outside the box in terms of where they're going to get their other talent from. There's a lot of talent out there. Organisations really struggle to understand how to tap into it.
Great. Thanks, Carol.
Okay, let's take another question, please, from the audience. The lady here in front. The microphone is on its way.
Right behind you.
Yeah, it will be here. This lady here. Could you give us your name and the organisation you represent, please?
Yes, I'm Angela. I'm from a Chinese media company called Sena. And my question is about China. We can see that last year, some technology giants in China suffered a lot from the doubts and those debates globally. So they're actually suffering from lots of pressure. Do you think that those doubts and hostility maybe a little bit will calm down a little bit this year? And what kind of threats actually the Chinese companies is facing in this year and maybe in the near term, medium term? Thank you.
It's clear that when you look at the CEO survey and the underlying trends, that the disruption and the level of threats and risks to technology companies, entertainment media companies, and other elements that are in China as well as serving the rest of the world do become, I'll call it a magnet for attention. And I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. It is at the crossroads as you think about those sectors of public privacy debates. It is at the center of the geopolitical debates in terms of how do you think about managing data and who has access to that. And it is clear when you look at the underlying trends of who's making these larger policy decisions around the world that we have a big fundamental argument going on between how China wants to work that issue versus the US, versus the Middle East, versus the UK, and all of those things. So I don't think the threats and the risks or the attention that sector go away anytime soon. The challenge is how do we actually get both the business community and the governments to be talking more about this and coming up with pragmatic solutions that think about what's in the best interest of the countries, what's in the best interest of the citizens who want that safety, that security, that sense of understanding so they can see the asset that it is, but also avoid the liability that it is. And I think that's going to be a really difficult debate. We're sitting here in Davos today, and over the next couple of days, we will have those debates. But from my perspective, and I think the perspective of PwC, those debates are not going away anytime soon. It is the new threat, and the question around do I trust those institutions is going to be second guessed for quite a time now as we look ahead. So I think we're up for a bumpy road. But again, those that execute really well in this, I think will do a really good job. Those that can't execute in that space of uncertainty and threats do have the risk of falling behind.
Okay, let's take another question here from the internet. It's about the United States. The question is, will the US remain the top target for investors if the government shutdown and Trump's trade war continue any longer?
Great. So I'll ask Tim Ryan to come to the stage. And just to remind people, if you look at the last couple of years, the U.S. has basically led the way in terms of being the number one choice for that investment destination. They actually supplanted China a couple of years ago. So Tim, maybe over to you in terms of the more recent events and the potential for impact on the U.S.
So I'm going to follow your lead and not get into the prediction business. But a couple of key points coming out in the survey. When, as Bob pointed out, the U.S. last year was the number one destination for inbound capital other than any other company's headquarter territory. That's still the case, but there is a significant decline going from the mid-50s to the mid-20s. So still a top target, but you've clearly got a decline at this point. It goes back to the points that Bob was talking about, the survey showed, which is uncertainty. When you think about government shutdown, when you think about trade policies. Our perspective is that those things, while not good for the economy, those things are kind of the new normal, to Bob's point. CEOs want certainty across the globe, but they also see some of the big benefits that come in the U.S. when you think about educational system, predictability, regulation. So we do still see the U.S. as a top destination for capital. The short-term actions, such as the shutdown, such as the trade wars, we ultimately think those get resolved, and we see the U.S. continue to be a good place for companies to put their talent, given good brands, good consumer markets, good talent out there. So while it's a slight decrease from last year, a significant decrease from last year, we still see long-term prospects pretty good for the U.S.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. And again, let's go back to the fundamentals of really what drives this investment opportunity that people look for around the world. You've got a confident consumer base, and you've got a resiliency in terms of the economy and all the threats that come its way. You do have rule of law and predictability of rule of law in terms of how organizations want that certainty around these things. So I think some of the fundamentals, besides some of the episodical issues that we're seeing right now, do continue to point to the U.S. as being a top destination for investment going forward.
Okay, let's take another question here from the audience. The gentleman here on the second row. Yeah.
Good evening, Jorge Valero with El Economista. One question which will be, well, the global economy, it's slowing down, it's a fact, and some people are already talking about the next recession. So considering this declining multilateralism and the presence of Donald Trump in the White House, do you believe that there will, in case there was a crisis, there will be a collective response as there was in 2008?
So look, I think when you look forward, no one's jumping to this issue of recession, or better said, no one's jumping to the catastrophic effect of what we dealt with in 2009. Now, again, we cannot predict these things. As somebody had said to us recently when we got together with the CEO, it could happen tomorrow. But the system has definitely taken steps to actually think about and react faster than ever before. And that's why I think it's important that the collaboration that has happened and worked together over the last 10 years or so in trying to deal with some of these underlying systemic issues continues. The need for quick dialogue, the need for understanding what's been done at the local level and why, the need for fast action, and the need for governments and other agencies, monetary or otherwise, to work together should that ever happen, I think is probably at the highest level of probability if it came our way, irrespective of the nationalism and populism that's out there right now. So I think the seeds have been sown to say we're better off than we were 10 years ago, but I can't predict whether or not we're going to have to use those seeds that have been sown so far. So I think we've got to walk very carefully and make sure we got the right leaders and make sure we actually are connecting those leaders. And that's one of the benefits, I think, being here in Davos and other institutions like that, to allow for relationships to be built, the ability to pick up the phone and talk to one another, and the ability to react quickly if, in fact, a crisis of that magnitude ever comes our way again.
Okay, can I take another question from the audience? There's a gentleman over there. Lovely, thank you.
Good evening. I'm David Stiers from the Ascent Leadership Networks. If nearly 50% of CEOs feel that to close the skills gap, there needs to be a significant training and upskilling, what do you predict that or recommend that should or will look like?
Great. So Carol, can I ask you to talk a little bit about how we've thought about what this looks like and what specific recommendations we're talking about, both at a company level as well as a countrywide level?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt that we really want educators, policymakers, governments and businesses to kind of come together and help solve that. But the reality is that's going to take far too long. And I think there's a lot that organisations can do and do today. And I think what we have to do is really deconstruct jobs as they are today. So a job is typically a series of about 30 tasks. And if you deconstruct those jobs into tasks, you can very quickly go through a process of working out what can be automated, what can be augmented, what can be offshored, and you then start to coalesce tasks around what you really truly need humans to do. And once you've worked out what you really need the humans to do within your organization, you then really need to look at the people in the organization and think about the capabilities that those people have, not their technical competency necessarily, not their knowledge, but the capabilities that they have. And if you start to really train those people around enhancing those capabilities, you can start to reframe the workforce. I think it's fair to say that organizations can't protect jobs, but their responsibility is to really help protect the people within their organizations so that they're skilled for the future.
Yeah, thanks, Carol. And the one thing that we would say is we can't over-pivot to just the technology side, and we can't under-pivot the humanity side of the equation. These things have to be thought about in tandem with one another, and that's why I think dissecting work and the future of work and what it looks like is really important in terms of how do you bring these things together. And the benefits you're looking for as a CEO is not only, you know, what you will do in terms of serving your stakeholders better, but also the sustainability of your organization. Likewise, as an organization, you're equally invested in the success of the individual person. How do you make them fit for purpose for whatever challenges and opportunities may come their way, regardless of if they're in that corporate or they choose to leave that corporate and go elsewhere. So I think there's a shared obligation to say, how do we, the business community, work more so with corporates, with governments, with the community leaders to say, how do we skill people for a world that they need new and different skill sets, regardless of where they may be, so they can actually capitalize on the benefits individually, and then the countries or the corporates can capitalize on those benefits as well for all the stakeholders that they have to actually manage.
Okay, a question from the internet. Now that Trump, Macron, Modi and May are not coming, who are you looking forward to hearing from in Davos?
That's an interesting one. And again, in the prediction game, you never know who may show up here in Davos or who actually maybe is on the schedule that chooses not to come. I would say the one that I do want to listen to carefully with a high degree of interest is Chancellor Merkel. She's sitting in a position right now where, as Harold said earlier, as we think about the EU and where it's going, is going to be an interesting phenomenon. And as we know, with her sort of transitioning out of her role, she's got some great thoughts and ideas in terms of what that world has looked like in the past and where it needs to go as we look forward in the future, and how best to execute it without the bias of wanting to be reelected going forward. So I think a straight conversation from him to the masses that are here in Davos, I think will be pretty interesting in terms of the telltale signs of what both our corporate community as well as our political community should be thinking about and acting on as we look ahead.
Okay, let's take that as a final question, really. Final thoughts to you, Bob, because look, given the results that we've had from the survey, what advice are you going to give to both business and government leaders whilst you're here in Davos?
So as you step back and think about the corporate community, as I said earlier, and as was evidenced by some of the responses you heard from the PwC delegates, corporates today have to be thinking about this world of uncertainty and scenario plan, but stay true to their strategy. And they've got to remain extremely focused on the best execution of that and really drive the cultural change at scale to then be able to capitalize on the opportunities and turn every threat into an opportunity in terms of competitive advantage for them to actually be in that bucket of those that are the winners of the future. In order to do that, you need to surround yourself with the right talent all the way through the organization. And if you don't have it, you have to find it. So execution becomes extremely important for the CEOs as you look forward to be best positioned to perhaps take some risk in a period of uncertainty, not avoid it. And that's how, in fact, differentiation between the winners and losers comes to life in a counter-cyclical way. Likewise, for the CEOs of countries, how do you set policy? How do you set the laws and regulations? How do you incent the right behaviors to happen in your countries for best execution around education and having the right skill sets, the ease of doing business? Because there's a huge opportunity for a corporate to say, I want to go to the place where it's easier to do business and capitalize on that opportunity that's out there. So there's an equal obligation to think about what's the asset you have today and what do you want to do to better that asset tomorrow? And we do see a couple of different countries in the CEO survey that have great skills and resources, or a focus on upskilling that is really a big advantage for the prime ministers, presidents, and others to go after. And last but not least is the government as well as the business community have got to work together. Government cannot solve these problems by themselves. The business community can't do it by themselves. Even within sectors, an individual corporate can't solve some of these problems by itself. So working together more so on the dialogue that we have here in Davos and the dialogue that we at PwC are able to enable becomes, I think, the role and responsibility that we have not only to serve our clients, but actually serve, consistent with our purpose, a larger group of stakeholders as we think about the role that PwC can play in terms of enabling, what the worldwide success may look like going forward. We have an opportunity to continue to answer questions with people on the internet as well as people here in the audience. So again, I'll go to where I started, which is a huge thank you for those that are with us here today, those that have taken time to watch over the video cast and the like, and we look forward to the continued engagement, not only with the media, but the individuals that actually can take the actions to make the world a better place going forward. So thank you very much, everybody, for the time. And Juliet, thank you very much for the emceeing of the event today as well.
And thank you very much for your time, Bob. I mean, that is sadly all we have time for, but if you'd like to download the full survey, then you can go to ceosurvey.pwc. That's ceosurvey.pwc. You can also follow us on Twitter at PwC, and don't forget to watch our Davos Daily updates on pwc.com/Davos. So thanks to you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again as well next year for the 23rd CEO survey. They keep on coming.
And we'll see how good our predictions really are.
I'll hold you to that.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Well done. Cheers.